Um, and I believe we're recording now. So great, that's lovely. From myself and Bridget, who is the board manager, and we'll be sharing the presentation together. So I'm not sure who's got control of the slides, but if we could have the next slide, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So just to remind everybody that a Safeguarding Adults Board is something that comes out of the Care Act, and each area is required to have a Safeguarding Adults Board, and I'm the chair of, in this case, of the Worcestershire Safeguarding Adults Board. And we have a duty, as it says here, and a vision, is to seek and provide assurance that adults at risk are safeguarded from abuse and neglect, and that all partners to the board will work collaboratively to seek assurances that people who have care and support needs are empowered and kept safe from abuse and neglect, and that where abuse occurs, partners will respond effectively and proportionately. So that's kind of like the high level. This is what a board is all about. And as I say, we're the Worcestershire board, and we're no different from any other board. Our next slide, please. So the business objectives for the year 20 to 21, and as they're outlined on page 7 of our annual report, a number of things to make comment on here. We wanted to make sure the system worked effectively, in other words, to continue to deliver the safeguarding requirements under what's called the Section 42 criteria, involving things like making safeguarding personal, and at the time, and still is the case, the changes to the Mental Capacity Act with the potential introduction of liberty protection safeguards were all assumed to be fairly business critical events for all boards, and indeed the Worcestershire board. And we were keen to ensure that learning was embedded across all services and pathways in these areas. We also, in that year, were keen to build on joint working with other Worcestershire partnerships to ensure that adult safeguarding issues received appropriate strategic ownership and provision across all services. And the three, what we describe as wicked issues, these are the issues that were particularly pertinent to the activity of the board in that year, and actually reflect, I think, most boards across the country, were rough sleeping, the role of a lead professional, and also exploitation. Just a lead professional, many of the safeguarding adult reviews that are done nationally refer to the lack of coordination of services for people. And if services had been more effectively coordinated, the outcome might have been different for the individual. And so we often talk about this: who is the lead professional trying to bring together a service package for an individual? And that's what the lead professional is referring to there. Can I have the next slide? So some of the achievements that I think we achieved the previous year, and indeed we've continued through into this last year that I have been involved with the board, we were able to produce an increased safeguarding messages during the pandemic, particularly around fraud awareness. Some of you might know that when I'm not working as the chair here in Worcestershire, I lead the national research into fraud and financial scams for the Head of Economic Crime Unit and the National Trading Standards Scams team. And you're probably aware that during the pandemic, the cases of fraud did rise quite significantly, and we ran a number of events around those areas. We were also able to jointly fund an exploitation post with South Worcestershire Community Safety Partnership. Exploitation is an area of growing concern, how people are exploited, and many boards have this as a priority area for them. And we're delighted that we've been able to employ somebody to specifically help us think through what is exploitation, how we respond to it, and how we can more effectively work together to support people who are being exploited. And this is also linked to what we call the CALM, the Complex Adult Risk Management Framework. which sets out to provide a joined-up approach for adults who have complex needs, which present risks but don't meet other social care or safeguarding criteria. And as some of you know, that's sometimes one of the issues when someone has needs but don't meet the criteria of various agencies and can fall through small cracks and holes. We also, during that year, were keen to work on the work around rough sleepers, and we continued with the publication of the Thematic review. And this is a review looking at a number of safeguarding adult reviews of issues to do with rough sleepers. We held a virtual seminar to disseminate the findings with providers to services to homeless people, and continue to work with the Health and Wellbeing Board and the Strategic Housing Partnership to ensure the recommendations are being implemented and are implemented. And this is an ongoing piece of work. We were also keen to set up a reference group for people involved in advocacy and people with lived experience and carers. And this was an area that we wanted to invest in during that year and have continued to do so to ensure that we hear those voices at the board level. And this has been a real important area of work, and it's helped supported the review of the Safeguarding Adults review process so that we can provide a better information to families and practitioners who are involved in a SAR. And recently, although not part of that previous year, more recently, we've set up an assurance panel made up of homelessness services to assist the potential impact of the actions taken to implement the thematic review of these recommendations. And this will also look at how to gain feedback from those experiencing or who have experienced homelessness. So that gives you a flavour of what we've been up to. With regards to SARS, just some basic information really. There were 9 referrals made. 2 of them met the criteria and a Safeguarding Adults review was commissioned. Of the remaining 6, 2 were single agency actions, 3 were no further action, and 1's pending. And during the year, 6 SARs were completed. 5 of those have been now published and on our website, and 1 was a joint DHR, so it's got to go through the Home Office process before we can publish it. But that gives you a little bit of information about the SARs. And the final page. Sorry, 2 more slides. What the data tells us, just to give you some sort of comparisons if you're interested with other areas. The number of concerns that were raised, there was a slight decrease from the previous year. However, interesting, I think in a positive way, those that met the Section 42 criteria increased significantly, 27% up from 14%. And I think that's a really positive indicator, giving us a sense that people reporting safeguarding concerns to us are clearer about which ones are meeting the criteria and which ones are not. I'm not quite sure what large percentage of reports related to the same person means, so I'm going to skip over that and come back to Bridget if we need to have that one question. The highest number of concerns were reported for neglect, followed by physical, psychological and financial abuse. These are pretty standard across the country, and neglect is a very high indicator of concern. The highest number of cases were from care homes in the residential setting. That's the situation there. Well, the outcomes of those safeguarding inquiries closed in 2021, the majority had a risk reduced or removed. Out of the 28 cases where it remained, 26 of these people were known to them, and the MSP means that the wishes of this person should be respected. Okay, and the final slide. So just some thoughts really about some of the risks and opportunities. I think it's been quite a difficult time, I'm sure, for your organisation as well, for us during the pandemic and lockdown. Organisations are under huge pressures, they're still under huge pressures, and sometimes that causes an issue of capacity for us to manage our subgroups, and we think that will continue to be an issue, but it's fair to say that we have been able to manage our business, and we still anticipate being able to manage our business, but it's increasingly a pressure for people to be released appropriately from their organisations to help us with the work of the board. For me, one of the greatest risks, though, in the whole safeguarding arena is general staffing and recruitment issues, particularly in social care. I think it's a real concern and a worry for all organisations. Where are we going to get the next generation of domiciliary care workers and residential care workers? Do we have enough of them? Do we have enough of the right quality? We seem to have a very high turnover of staff in these fields. They do a critical job, are often, I think in my view, underappreciated or undervalued, the type of work that they do. And I think this is something that we as a general society are going to have to start thinking far more broadly and widely about how it is we can make the employment and the career opportunities more attractive. And it's not just about pay. I mean, clearly pay is an issue here, but I think valuing staff and staff feeling valued and feeling that they're doing a worthwhile job is critical in this. I mentioned earlier about the Mental Capacity Act amendments. This is to do with something called liberty protection safeguards. They've been delayed. They were due to be implemented on the 1st of April of this year. And up until just a few weeks ago, we were being told by the government that the liberty protection safeguards would still come into effect on the 1st of April. A few weeks ago, we were informed this has now been delayed. Indeed, the consultation document came out last week. And I think there's a 12-week public consultation on the proposals. There's no actual date yet set for the liberty protection safeguards to be commenced, but it's likely to be about a year. And finally, in my summary, risk and opportunities, I think one of the opportunities that we've got, and indeed we've all got in our work, is building the important links with the new integrated health boards to ensure that new systems that come about in health continue to safeguard the residents of Worcestershire in the most appropriate and effective way. And we as a board will be wanting to work with the ICB as it develops to ensure that safeguarding is key in one of their areas of their priorities. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm more than happy to take any questions about either the annual report or the types of work that we try to undertake as a board. Please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Does anybody from the board have any questions for Professor Keith? Simon.
Thank you, Keith. I think we've met. I'm Simon Adams.
Hello,
I'm
Simon.
Director, of Health Watch. One of the questions I've got for you, and you touched on it under indicators, you said that you had quite a lot of referrals for neglect.
Yeah.
Right. And one of our interests was in self-neglect, which, of course, the Care Act introduced into safeguarding. But certainly one of our concerns sort of from around about 2016, I think, when we started looking at rough sleeping, was the extent to which the agencies and providers were actually recognising that self-neglect could be a safeguarding issue. And I wondered if you had any view on where those organisations who provide services to us, where they are with that now, because I mean, it clearly involved a lot of training to get that message over. Because I think until the Care Act changed it, safeguarding was seen as something that was people would be having things done to them rather than necessarily something they might have neglected to do themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for the question, an important question, and quite a complex area in that arena of how much freedom of choice do we allow people versus when do we as the so-called state intervene? And clearly there are debates around those sorts of issues. And within that debate, this whole area of self-neglect is a growing area of interest and concern, isn't it? And what's also interesting is it's quite an umbrella term, isn't it? Self-neglect is not one set of symptoms or issues or problems. It's an umbrella of lots of different things, and ones that I think professionally and services are still struggling to fully understand and fully think through how does one deal with those situations. So, for example, if a person who is primarily bedridden refuses to have an air mattress to help them alleviate pressure sore issues, should they be allowed to say, no, I don't want a special mattress to reduce my pressure sores? What happens if that person then ends up developing pressure sores? At what point should we consider there is a neglect issue here? Does that make sense? These are highly complex issues around people's liberty to make choices. And I think what we're going to be having to do more and more is think through, how do we work more effectively with people so that we're not always seen to be doing to people, but working alongside with people to try and reduce the incidents and the opportunities for self-neglect, rather than just assuming that someone is self-neglecting and that's their choice in that kind of rather crass way. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Simon, other than to simply sort of remind you and say, it's probably on your agenda, it's on our agenda, and I think it's something that we need to keep discussing and thinking through. And I think it's something we need to really also get our professional colleagues up to speed with, both in their training and their understanding, and what I call their professional curiosity.
Yeah, I think that's the point that we were sort of getting to, was actually colleagues actually understanding that self-neglect could be a self-guarding issue before we get into the more nuanced approach to it that you've just told us about. And of course, what we don't want to see is somebody's right to make a decision, as you've just said, be an easy option to not providing a service.
Absolutely right, and that's exactly right. And it's too easy to simply say everybody's got the right to make an unwise decision. Clearly, they do have the right to make an unwise decision, but we also need professionally to start asking questions. Why are these people in these situations? Is there exploitation? Is there alcohol is another issue, isn't it? People who have alcohol dependency problems. I think we need to understand far more as services the impact and effect of alcoholism on people and their ability to make rational decisions when you've got that addiction in the background. Does that make sense? So are people making wise decisions or unwise decisions, or actually is the addiction completely overpowering their ability to make any decision because it's an addiction? And we just need to have a lot more thought and a lot more thinking on these things. And you're absolutely right, Simon. We need to straight away start thinking this could well be a safeguarding issue and we need to consider it.
And Keith, I mean, from our perspective, we really welcome what we would see as a fresh approach by the chair.
Thank you.
To that. So thank you.
Could I just add that in terms of sort of the practical way we're approaching this at the moment, we've done an extensive review of the self-neglect policy, which shift the emphasis to the way that Keith has described it in there, and also the complex adult risk management framework we see is very much linking into that in terms of making sure that meetings go ahead and take that approach in them. We're hoping, well, we're in the final stages of sign off now, so we're hoping that will be published early in the next financial year. And then we're actually planning, we're linking it with the exploitation coordinator, and we're going to just roll it out so that, having a lot of sort of events to make sure that staff and people are aware of this policy and framework. And we're also linking that into a hoarders framework. And all of those have been consulted on widely. We've sent them out to various networks and stuff to get their feedback on those.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, did you have a question as well?
Thank you, Chair. Professor, thank you for that briefing. I had heard some of it before at the Health and Wellbeing Board. If I may just say that the self-neglect policy, which Healthwatch contributed to the redrafting of, is a real improvement, and we look forward to that arriving. It's much clearer. And I think I would also just like to add to your point about how we get round the addiction problem. We're dealing in my day job at St Paul's with people who have alcohol and drug addiction, sometimes both. And sometimes quite simply what does happen, and the board are the safeguarding team are very helpful, is just to have a conversation with, to express our worries and anxieties about what we're trying to do, and the professional on the other end of the phone is a reassuring voice to say, look, you're doing the right things. And that as simple as that can work really, really well, because we feel sometimes we're equipped with the knowledge, but we like to check. So I think those types of proactive liaison conversations are to be supported abroad. They work, they help.
Jonathan, I'd go farther. I think they're absolutely critical. I think that's what we're realizing as we explore these complex and often difficult issues, aren't they? We're going to get nowhere until we start communicating together more effectively. And you know, we've produced this new self-neglect policy. Please don't think it's the final or the end of. If you've got good ideas, if you've got ideas for how we could improve it or alter it or edit it or add new dimensions to it, we're up for that. And as you rightly say, Jonathan, we do have to start having what I call this professional curiosity. We have to start asking questions and actually engaging more effectively. I think one of the problems we've had in the last decade or so with the original Care Act is that we came a little bit too much of a box ticking exercise and processing paperwork. And you will know, Jonathan, the sorts of people that you're working with and your organisation's working with. You go a long way by simply building relationships and communication and trust. And a lot of problems can be headed off and not become nearly as severe if that early intervention happens. And I'm all up for that, Jonathan, and you know, welcome any thoughts or comments from you or your colleagues about how we might think about that more effectively.
Thank you. I just a question about section 42 criteria. This is an area which perhaps the wider audience don't understand the difference. Would you mind just capturing what the 42 criteria requires?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that a board is meant to be working in is people that have care and support needs. And if you don't have care and support needs, then you often fall through the criteria for being under the auspices of a board. But there are an awful lot of people that might not have care and support needs today, but unless their needs are supported and helped, they're going to have care and support needs tomorrow because their situation is going to get worse. Does that make sense? So there is this kind of slight, I'm going to be a little bit careful now because this is being recorded, isn't it? Wearing my professor's hat on, this slight juxtapose here, isn't there? Because we are supposedly here rightly to safeguard people and to ensure appropriate safeguarding. And yet, if we're not careful, Section 4 type criteria can mean that we only look at and only work with and are only responsible for certain groups of people and not others. And that, if you're not careful, can stop a lot of preventative early interventions, which end up becoming problems later down the track, which are in no one's interest to do and to deal with. I mean, I would give an example of that, Jonathan, would be fraud. You might not have any care and support needs today, but your elderly relative, if they are defrauded of their life savings and lose everything tomorrow, a combination of having no money and the psychological trauma of having been robbed of your life savings and all that goes with it, you might well have multiple care and support needs the day afterwards, if that makes sense, and very much come into our criteria. And so I'm very keen that we try and be as broad as possible in our understanding of these things and as flexible as possible in our rules and limits, so that we don't just simply say, that's not our business.
Thank you. That's answered my questions. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the board? Oh, John.
Thanks, Joe. Keith, I wonder if you could just, I've got two questions in particular. One is around the care home referrals that you mentioned, whether you could just unpack that a little bit for us, because that's an area where particularly when they've not had visitors over the last couple of years as much as you might expect or want, whether that's had an impact at all. And I'll come to the second question after that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm just going to check with Bridget. Bridget, have we seen an upsurge with that during COVID?
We did. When lockdown ceased, we did see an increase in referrals from care homes in terms of safeguarding concerns that were raised. Yeah, we saw. I haven't got the data in front of me. We did a review at the time. I'm happy to find that data and send it in to you if you want that. But we definitely did see a surge of increase in concerns raised when lockdown was eased.
Thank you, Bridget. Does that answer your question then, John? I mean, it's we're not obviously the regulator. We're not CQC. So of course, if there is if somebody wanted to report a concern or make a complaint, that would be the normal route. We're just dealing with the learning of these things. But I think it would be my view that as a board, alongside you folks in Health Watch, that we need to keep a very strong eye on the care sector. Now, there are clearly many residential and nursing homes out there doing great work. Sterling staff, going above and beyond. And there are people that have just done magnificent work during lockdown in very difficult circumstances. But we would be naive to think that it's always good, because there's enough evidence out there that in the total care economy, in the total care system, these are often the areas of potential weakness. And I think we owe it to keep a tab on it. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the concerns I've got is, how does one manage with a real difficulty of recruitment? I mean, how close are we to one day waking up when the manager of a nursing or a care home in Worcester turns up to work one day and no staff turn up? And there are 25 residents, but nobody's there to do the shift. Is that a possibility? I think it possibly is a possibility these days. Too many possibilities there. But, how do we manage those sorts of risks, and what are we considering? What do we think about? These are sorts of things that I'm concerned about and wanting and trying to seek assurance from a number of people about.
Yeah, I agree with those comments, Keith. And I think also the comments you made earlier about the need for awareness raising, about training, about sharing these things more widely is pertinent to the residential care sector and to the domiciliary care sector. So it's good to hear those things are happening now.
Thank you.
If I could move on to the second question, it was really around the thematic review into the deaths of rough sleepers. And the process that you've been following more recently in terms of the implementation of the recommendations with the Quality Assurance and Performance Subcommittee. We've had the opportunity of scrutinising that with you.
Yeah.
And what's happening. Are you able to say a little bit more about how that's going?
Bridget, would you like to come in on this? Because Bridget and the team have been leading on this.
Yeah, how the process has been set up, and we've got a set of terms of reference from there. It's an assurance panel that's been set up as almost, as you describe it, John, a subgroup of the performance, quality and assurance. And that assurance panel is made up of representatives from the homeless section, but also housing sit on there as well. So because it's really those that deliver the services to people who are homeless or potentially could become rough sleepers or are rough sleepers. And so that assurance panel, as we get feedback from the different, there are a set of, I think it's 15 recommendations on there. And as each organisation that has had recommendation on their response to performance and quality assurance, that goes to that panel who then scrutinise it. And what that panel does is look at those and say if they feel that it can be closed because what they've responded with is sufficient, or if they don't feel it's sufficient, then they send it back to P&QA and say we want further information. At the moment, none of those actions have been closed. We've only looked at the strategic housing partnerships actions at the moment. At the next meeting that's set up, we're looking at the response from, I think it's the CCG, and we'll also look at, because there are a couple of recommendations for the Safeguarding Adult Board in there, and so we'll look at how those are progressing. So at that meeting, and we looked at the ones from the Strategic Housing Partnership, and we've sent those back to Performance and Quality Assurance. None of them have been closed yet because we didn't feel that it was a sufficient place to close them and have the assurance that they'd fully implemented them. But in fairness to their response, it was just an update, and I don't think in any of them I think they would know that it's not at a state where it could be closed yet as well. But I think what was useful about it is actually the assurance panel also get an opportunity to say in there what they think good looks like, and that goes back to that group as well, so that they can, when they're looking at how they're implementing this, they have feedback on what they would like to see in there as well. So, you know, there was lots of comments in that last one around more service user engagement and consultation through things like the strategy, the homelessness strategy that's being reviewed, an emphasis on communication, which is a joint one for us and the Strategic Housing Partnership, and that's particularly in relation to how we communicate with the public. I mean, both yourself and Jonathan were on that. I don't know if you can remember any other things that were on there where we were sort of saying, where we were giving them advice on there. But I mean, it's a process that I personally think has improved our scrutiny of what's come back to the assurance panel, and it's one that I'd actually like to emulate on other safeguarding adult reviews in the future, but we've yet to present that to the board as a suggestion. But that's something I think myself and Keith would certainly like to see be developed, is sort of more scrutiny, particularly from people with lived experience or organisations that deliver those services.
Yes, thanks for that, Bridget. I mean, I appreciate it's early days, but one of the things that has impressed me about it is the desire to get people with lived experience to contribute to the process, and the fact that there is accountability, that people aren't just let off the hook. There's follow up, and there's an opportunity and a sense that people want to get this right for the end user, as it were, the people that need to make sure that services are in the right place and people are working together. So that's been quite helpful from our point of view to see that.
Thank you, John. John, I want to add my personal reflections on this. I mean, I'm only employed for 3 days a month to chair the board and all of its activities. So clearly I can't attend all of these subgroups. I have a very high level overview of these things, but I do want to give you my assurance that I think these are the critical, you know, if we don't do these things right, there's no point in having a board. And so I want to keep that invitation open to people like yourself, John, and others from Health Watch and other interested parties in the arena. The thematic review was done. There are 15 recommendations. We want to be pushing on those recommendations. We want to see over time appropriate action on those recommendations. And I hope that in a year's time, if not before, I can come back to a group like this with the next annual report and tell you what happened with those actions, and that you're aware of them, if that makes sense. We're not going to turn it around overnight, but we've got to keep committed to this. And we've got good people, and we've got people like yourselves working with us. And we want to be open about that. We want to be clear about what the recommendations are, and also be clear about how those recommendations are or how they are not being met.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Keith. That's helpful.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask if there's any members of the public who have any questions. Hugo, I see you've got your hand up.
Hi, hi Keith, hi Bridget, hi Health Watch. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really helpful. I had a look at the report, but having that kind of vocalized was really helpful. I have two questions, if I may, really quickly. Keith and Bridget, 45% of the funding to the Safeguarding Board in that report was given by Worcestershire County Council to a total roughly of £57,615.51. The last chair was paid £500 a day for his work to chair the Safeguarding Board, and I assume yours is in that region also. My question to the Safeguarding Board is, how independent and accountable are you to the board? How independent and accountable are you and the board? And are you scrutinised by elected members of the County Council? My question to Health Watch, particularly Simon, if I may, is on the 8th of September 2017, you publicly said on a public board meeting that you had no confidence in adult safeguarding services in Worcestershire. Could you give me an update of whether that view has changed, and if it has, how it has, please? Thank you.
So if I could go first, Hugo, and I'm sorry, I didn't fully hear all your question. I'm going to try and, if I don't answer your question, come back to me is what I'm trying to say as a preface. And I think part of your question was, is the activity of the Safeguarding Board scrutinised by Worcestershire County Council's Scrutiny Committee? And if that was your question, yes, it is. So I went to Worcestershire County Council Scrutiny Committee, I think it was last week or the week before, and presented, Bridget's shaking her head, nodding her head, and presented our annual report to them there. And they were able to ask questions there. There was another part to your question, Hugo. Could you just remind me of it so I get the answer right?
Of course. How independent and accountable are you and the board in general?
How independent? I think the board, the idea of all safeguarding boards is that they are set up as independent, with an independent chair. The authorities come through the Care Act, and the idea is that they are independent so that no one member of the board could put inappropriate pressure on the board to do one thing or another thing. In other words, we're not owned by the council, we're not owned by the CCG, we're not owned by the police force. We are independent of those people, and we're an independent body made up of those members, including the voluntary sector, including other groups from citizens. We've got users on the board, and the idea is that all boards are set up to be independent, to provide independent overview and independent scrutiny of the safeguarding issues within the geographical patch that the board operates.
I have one issue with that, is how can you be independent when 45% of your funding comes from the county council, and also the rest of your funding comes from the police and the CCG, who are both statutory, all three of them are statutory partners on the board. How can you be independent when you are funded by people who sit on the board? And your salary comes from a summary of those partners.
Okay, so I think what I can say is that every safeguarding board in the country is funded in a very, very similar way. It is the statutory partners of the boards that provide the funding, and indeed are expected to provide the funding. It's how boards are funded. It's just the mechanism that happens. So in effect, I think you're asking some members of the board are funders, and some members of the board are not funders, if that makes sense. And does that give an equal power base? I don't believe it does. I think it would be my duty as the independent chair to ensure that all members of the board and all parties of the board have an equal voice and an equal say, and such that just because one member or one group of particular members provided funding, that wouldn't sway the way the board operated.
Could I just add that, forgive me to say this, but it's not, even though it's not going through the same process, but it's not dissimilar in some ways to the way Health Watch is funded, because Health Watch would receive it, be commissioned through the local authority or other bodies, and they have to maintain that independence as well. I know we have a slightly different role, but I think it's a commonality that's across quite a few boards, and I do agree with Keith that it can be difficult. You have to make sure that you keep that independence in there as well.
Thank you, Bridget. Simon, did you want to respond to the second part of Hugo's?
Just before I respond to the second part, and Bridget's made a point that I was going to make. You know, it is not in this country an uncommon arrangement for those people who are there to hold bodies to scrutiny to be funded by those bodies, because effectively we're funded by the state, and I don't think it's ever got in our way in terms of us actually exercising our independence. And I can vouch for the chair, because I've been present at the meetings he referred to, when I've witnessed them being scrutinised by county council members and district council members. I think, Keith, haven't I? So I've witnessed that, and in fact, I asked questions of Keith at that meeting. So I can vouch for that, Hugo. In respect to the what I said, I was expressing my concern in 2017 in the context of rough sleeping and safeguarding rough sleepers at a time when the Adult Safeguarding Board was resisting suggestions that there should be as SAR carried out into deaths of rough sleepers in the circumstances of Carden Banfield. And I think we've come along, and I think, Hugo, that's history. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not quite sure how useful it is to bring that up, but I think we've come a long way. And the fact that I can now say that, particularly with John Taylor sitting on, our board member sitting on the, I don't know whether I got it the right way round. Is it the performance and quality assurance, or quality assurance and performance?
He has the papers from the performance quality assurance, which he doesn't sit on, but he has the papers.
He has oversight of it.
Yes, he has oversight, but he is attending the with oversight again of the assurance panel, specifically looking at the sleepers. So
and I think you've heard this morning we've moved on a long way from where we were. My question about the approach to self-neglect was a deliberate question to get a sense of how far we have moved from a position we were in, where I was told that have to accept that some people want to live as rough sleepers, and a suggestion that we should let them get on with it. So I think we've come a long way, Keith, and I thank you for your contribution this morning.
My absolute pleasure.
I hope, Hugo, that answers your question.
It does indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Professor Keith Brown. And thank you very much, Bridget, for attending our meeting.